Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, State of the Agricultural Union. We're glad to be able to engage with you and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. We're looking forward to today's discussion, where we'll explore the critical challenges and opportunities shaping the future of American agriculture. Today is also National Ag Day, a time to recognize the essential role agriculture plays in feeding the nation and driving our economy. It's fitting that we're discussing the state of the agricultural union as farmers, ranchers, and agricultural leaders are navigating an increasingly complex landscape marked by shifting policies, economic pressures, and emerging risks. By bringing together experts and policy makers, we can work towards solutions that ensure a more resilient and sustainable agricultural system for the future. But before we begin today's program, I'd like to take just a few minutes to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we're an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships and coalitions to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, I encourage you to reach out. I would like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you'll not only be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you'll also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads on our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for our farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends. The link will also be posted in the chat today. In addition to learning more about Friends of Farm Foundation and our work, by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect on our social media platforms. If you're posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you please use the hashtag Farm Foundation Forum. Before I hand the floor over to our moderator today, here are just a few last housekeeping notes. There will be an audience question and answer session at the end. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat to queue questions. The forum is being recorded and will be posted at the farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we'll send out a link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll receive a link with a brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing that survey. Now let's turn to today's forum. Today's panel of experts will be moderated by Farm Foundation's president and CEO, Sherry Rogie-Fidler. Sherry is a fifth-generation farm owner and operator, an entrepreneur of an organic branded food industry, and a founder of an agricultural consulting firm. Prior to joining Farm Foundation, Sherry was a CEO of a group of companies serving over 1,000 farmers. Thank you for moderating today's panel, Sherry, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, and especially thank you, Tim, for pulling together our amazing set of speakers today for what I'm sure is going to be a fabulous conversation during a really important time. Also, a shout out to Morgan and Ellen from our team. Again, we have shown agility as a team to pull this timely session together, so thank you to the Farm Foundation team. I'm really excited to get to our speakers today, but I do just want to take a moment to share three framing remarks before we dig into our first presentation. As Tim mentioned, today is about the state of the agriculture union. And in Farm Foundation style, we're going to be looking at it from multiple lenses. But it is by no means exhaustive. I know each of you in the audience knows that you could probably come up with, your top 10 list of things you want to hear about today. So we've done our best to assemble some of the core issues, but we won't get to all of the core issues for the state of agriculture today. But perhaps we can pick up some of them in the Q&A session as well. We believe that the topics today are good anchors and some of the things that are top of mind to you, but we really look forward to the conversation. So encourage you to, throughout today, use that Q&A session and put your thoughts and questions there. Second, I do want to say that Farm Foundation has 90 plus years of being nonpartisan and independent. And so it's important to note that as we engage in this conversation today. I've encouraged our speakers to not shy away from challenges and just know that in today's environment, sometimes acknowledging the challenges might sound partisan. But in fact, in my reading, I noticed that the University of Michigan and the Michigan Confidence Index has really shown what I think many of us are feeling, that regardless of where we stand on politics, our expectations have changed, our concerns have changed, and we're trying to navigate the waters together. In fact, the studies showed that Democrats' expectations have declined 20%, Republicans' confidence and expectations have fallen 10%, and moderates have fallen 12%. And maybe that's a short-term thing, and that's part of what we'll be talking about today is maybe short-term challenges, longer-term opportunities, but we're all trying to navigate the waters together today and looking at those challenges and opportunities, because with changes, there's always opportunities as well. Last, I just want to touch on the farmer perspective. Prior to this forum, I reached out to our network of farmers and heard back from more than I've ever heard before. I asked them to share their challenges and opportunities, and I'll be looking for ways to punctuate our conversation with some of those perspectives. I know in my own farming operation that we're trying to put our heads together as well to navigate these waters. Trade is top of mind. Our risk management strategies are top of mind, trying to see what we might have to do differently this year and as we look ahead to the future. So as I said, I'll look for opportunities to weave those into our conversation and really value the engagement with farmers to help us understand what's top of mind. And with that, I do want to mention as well, while we will look for opportunities, we know that many farm families are struggling. And I did just want to elevate the Farm Family Wellness Alliance. You can go to Farm Foundation's website to learn about the Farm Family Wellness Alliance. It's a suite of services for all farm families across the U.S. It's a community of farmer-to-farmer engagement on a platform, and then a wraparound of services and advice on legal matters, financial matters, and mental health and free counseling. So I commend that to you on our website as well. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our first speaker. Amanda Countryman was the 2022 Farm Foundation Agricultural Economics Trade Fellow. That's how I personally got to know her. And then I'm thrilled to also announce today is the first day that I can say she is also now a Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellow. So we're really thrilled to welcome her into our Roundtable program. She's a professor in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department at Colorado State University, and her research explores international trade policies' impact on agriculture using econometric modeling. She specializes in trade reforms, WTO policies, and the effects of transboundary animal diseases on global markets. Amanda's work provides critical insights into agricultural trade and economic development. Amanda, we're so happy to have you with us today to share your insights and look forward to a great conversation. So Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. So I'm very excited and honored to be a part of this really important conversation this morning. And as you'll see on this first slide that I have next, is that I'm going to provide a fairly succinct overview of agricultural trade and policy in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about why trade matters, provide a brief U.S. agricultural trade snapshot, talk about some U.S. trade policy highlights, and then discuss a bit about some trade challenges and opportunities. So on our next slide, I want to motivate and just remind us all that trade is driven by comparative advantage. So something that's interesting as an economist is that we oftentimes disagree on a lot of different points when it comes to economics. But one thing that economists universally agree about is comparative advantage. And the concept that individuals, states, countries, regions can focus on what each country is relatively better at, trade for what we're relatively less good at producing, and that leads to the ability for us to foster economic growth. When we think about trade and what that provides for our economies, consumers benefit from lower prices and increased variety in the economy. And there are varying effects of trade on producers. So, on one hand, producers can benefit from exports and also benefit from lower input costs for things that we import from abroad on the input side. But it's also really important to acknowledge that producers face competition from imports. So, there is a lot of challenge for producers who participate in import oriented industries when we have import competition. Similarly, on the job side, when we think about employment, we have this dual-sided effect of trade, where we have job creation when we think about export-oriented industries, and when we're able to export products, that creates jobs that are associated with exporting. But at the same time, similar to the producer side, we can experience job losses when we have import competition. So while on the whole, as an economy, we can benefit tremendously from trade, it's really important to just start out and acknowledge that there are also real challenges that arise when we think about trade. Oftentimes, when I talk about why I'm very passionate about trade, I start at the breakfast table with this little picture we have here. Well, many of us start our breakfast or our mornings with a cup of coffee, and I think it would be potentially cost prohibitive if we weren't able to import coffee from around the world. Similarly, I'm looking at just this breakfast picture. We could spend our entire time talking around the themes that are emerging at the breakfast table. So grateful for incredible pork producers in the United States that are producing that bacon that I love to have in the morning. Egg producers who are facing extreme challenges. And we have Jim, who's going to talk more about some of the challenges associated with animal disease here in just a bit. And also avocados. If we weren't able to import avocados from Mexico, for example, many of us may not have avocados in our grocery carts on a weekly basis because we may not be able to afford them. So I just want to motivate us by really thinking about, why is trade important? Why does it matter? And how is it important for agriculture? So on the next slide, that's going to lead us to our agricultural trade snapshot. So the USDA ERS 2025 forecast shows exports at 170 billion for US agricultural products, while imports are 215.5 billion. So as you'll see, just starting a few years ago, the US has become a net importer of agricultural products. And this is a change that we've seen since the 1990s. The US has predominantly been a net exporter of agricultural products, but over the past few years, we have turned into a net importer of agriculture overall. And of course, this varies when we think about the different types of products that we both export and import. So it's important to think about these things on a product level. What I will highlight is that one of the key drivers for why the US has become a net importer of agricultural products is a tremendous increase in what are referred to as horticultural products, which are fruits, vegetables, and nuts, for example. So on the next slide, we can dig down a little bit more into thinking about some very largely aggregated product groups for agriculture and what we export and import. So again, as I already mentioned, on the left side of the graph, we can see horticultural products. Again, that's primarily fruits, vegetables, and nuts. And we import far more in this category than what we export. So again, this is really driving that change over time in the past few years for the US becoming a net importer of agricultural products. That's really driven by an increase in imports of fruits, vegetables, and nuts. On the same hand, we've also increased exports in that category, but just not to the same degree that we have increased things on the import side. I also just want to mention and highlight and really celebrate the fact that the US is a true powerhouse when it comes to agricultural trade. So we can also see the importance of livestock, dairy, and poultry, which is our second largest export category behind horticultural products in terms of value. We're also a tremendously important exporter of grains and feeds, also oil seeds. We import more sugar and tropical products than what we export. And I also wanted to just highlight that our cotton industry is incredibly dependent on exports. Since we no longer process the majority of our cotton in the United States, our cotton is exported to be processed outside of the US. So on the next slide, we can start thinking about who are our key trade partners. So when we think about agricultural export partners, our top 3 export destinations for US agriculture are Mexico, Canada, and China. And almost 50% of US agricultural exports go to these top 3 export destinations. So again, Canada and Mexico are neighbors to the north and south, incredibly important export partners. And on the next slide, we can think about who we import agricultural products from. So again, recall that we've had a dramatic increase over time in fruit and vegetable imports, for example. Our largest import partners, so who we import agricultural products from, our top 2 trade partners on the import side are the same, Canada and Mexico. Mexico being number 1, Canada being number 2. And our third largest import partner, so who we import agricultural products from, in terms of value, is the European Union. So just over 50% of US imported agricultural products, again, come from our top 3 trade partners, Mexico, Canada, and the European Union. So on the next slide, we can start thinking about how US trade policy is taking shape currently. So President Trump, after taking office, announced his America First trade policy. So the focus of the current US administration's trade policy is to prioritize a production economy focus with 3 specific goals. And the goals of this America First trade policy, focusing on production, are to increase manufacturing share of GDP in the United States, to increase real median household income, and to decrease the goods trade deficit. And so we can talk a bit more during the Q&A how some of the policies that are being considered can affect these 3 key priority areas or 3 goals of this production economy focus. But first off the bat, one of the first approaches that the president is planning to implement is to increase import tariffs. So if we impose import tariffs, and I'll talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of how tariffs function in just a minute, but at the end of the day, when we impose an import tariff, this is a market distortion that creates a price wedge between our domestic price and the world price. And that has the potential to benefit import competitive industries, but that can be at the detriment of consumers and exporters, especially when we consider a situation where we face retaliation in other markets. So on the next slide, we can think a bit more about import tariffs. So when we impose an import tariff, that means that there is essentially a tax on imports when they arrive at the border in the United States. So what that does is it makes imported products relatively more expensive. If we think about the effects of an import tariff at home, what that does is it increases import prices. And when we have increased import prices, we're going to import less. So if we think back to as prices rise, consumers have a decrease in quantity demanded. So on one hand, we're going to have increased import prices, which will lead to us importing less. That creates less competition in the domestic market that can potentially benefit producers, but has mixed effects throughout the rest of the economy. So the government does collect tariff revenue. Consumers lose on the whole because when we have freer trade, we have lower price levels overall in the economy, which again is driven by comparative advantage. When we focus on what we're relatively better at and we partially specialize and export those products, that allows us to import products for those things that we're relatively less efficient at producing. So on the whole, consumers lose when we have import tariffs, when we think about the economy as a whole, because we will have higher price levels on one hand. There are also mixed worker and producer effects that I already talked a bit about. Again, we have job creation effects when we have increased exports, but then we also have job destruction when we think about import competition. So if we have an import tariff and we protect the domestic industry, that can be job boosting for workers who work in import-oriented industries, but then we can again face potential challenges for producers and for workers who work in export-oriented sectors. Again, if we face retaliation from other countries, that means that if another country puts an import tariff on the United States, then our products become relatively more expensive in that external market. So if US exports become less competitive or more expensive, that means that we are likely to export less because other countries are going to seek alternative suppliers who are relatively more affordable if if we face retaliation in the United States. So we've learned from experience with the prior trade war. Right off the board, it was extremely challenging for U.S. agriculture. When we think about the importance of U.S. exports, especially for a lot of our bulk commodities, more than half of U.S. soybeans are exported, for example. So when we face retaliation and U.S. exports become more expensive, this damages producers in export-oriented industries. In the past, we had trade-related domestic support in both 2018 and 2019 to compensate producers for lost exports as a result of the trade conflict. So we had the market facilitation program in both 2018 and 2019, which over those 2 years provided about $23 billion in producer payments to compensate producers for losses experienced during the trade conflict. We also had 2 other programs that were a part of trade-related domestic support, including the food purchase and distribution program, which was valued at about $2.6 billion over those 2 years, as well as the agricultural trade promotion program, which received about $300 million again over those 2 years. However, it's uncertain if we will have a future trade aid package as we did in 2018 and 2019. Something that Sherry also already highlighted is the challenges that we're facing on overall in U.S. agriculture and tight margins. And we already have $10 billion in economic assistance that is going to be distributed, as well as an additional $20 billion in disaster relief that is targeted for U.S. agriculture. So it's uncertain if we face a retaliatory trade environment in the weeks and months to come, if there will be a future trade aid package as there has been in the past. So I just want to highlight that it's uncertain what the domestic trade policy response may be if we end up in a situation where we face retaliation in response to trade policy imposed in the United States. So moving to our next slide, I want to leave us with some thoughts and hopefully spur some additional conversation in the Q&A. There are a lot of topics that I have not mentioned or have time to talk about in the moment, but hopefully this is a primer for a rich discussion to come. So when we think about some trade challenges and also opportunities, we still have concerns remaining related to the trade relationship with China. There are extremely concerning challenges related to geopolitical conflict that persist in the world that have really important implications for US and global agriculture. Exchange rates and strong competition really matter when we think about international markets. So we have really strong competition in agriculture, and a few of our coming speakers are going to talk a bit more about that. But you know, Brazil is another powerhouse in agriculture who's ready to keep expanding export markets in the months and years to come. So again, depressed commodity prices overall and net farm income declines are certainly concerning. And again, just really want to highlight that uncertainty for US and global trade policy. Some things we haven't dug into nearly enough. In addition to tariff barriers, we also have real challenges related to non-tariff barriers. Jim's going to talk about animal health. We also have plant health issues and a variety of other non-tariff measures that other countries have implemented or plan to implement or strengthen in the future that can challenge US agriculture. So again, trade restrictions create challenges for globally integrated supply chains. And in the US, we have an extremely globally integrated supply chain. So you have challenges on the production side, we have challenges on the input side and the output side of things. But one opportunity I want to leave you with, as an optimist, we have to end on an opportunity. And something I hadn't mentioned yet and meant to when we were talking about changes in US exports is that we have seen increasing exports of high value US agricultural products. So in 2024, fiscal year 2024, about 68% of total US agricultural trade was considered a high value product. So that's total trade minus bulk commodities. That's expected to rise to 70% in this current fiscal year. So I think when we think about opportunities on the US side, there are certainly opportunities for continued growth in high value US agricultural products. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to our additional presenters and a rich, vibrant discussion to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda, for getting us started in a wonderful foundational way for what is top of mind for many of us with regard to trade. I loved the comparative advantage and loved the sharing of the breakfast plate. I think that's a great way to realize how global our food system is and that the trade really does affect our everyday food choices and prices. So look forward to more conversation during the Q&A time, Amanda. So next, we're going to welcome Matt Clark. Matt is the Senior Rural Economy Analyst at Terrain, focusing on the impacts of interest rates, land values, and other macroeconomic trends on agriculture. As part of the Terrain team of economists, he delivers expert analysis to the customers of American Ag Credit, Farm Credit Services of America, and Frontier Farm Credit. He has an extensive background analyzing and forecasting key commodities, providing macroeconomic analysis, statistical validation of risk models, and chairing various commodity and risk analysis committees. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we could all use your insights on our farms as well, but looking forward to your remarks today. Take it away.
Oh, thank you, Sherry. Thank you, everybody, for having me on and for tuning in today. I titled this presentation, The Farm Economy as I See It, Farm Bill Implications. I titled it that way because not only do I live in a rural America area, not only am I engaged in some activities of farming, but also to working with Farm Credit, as Sherry noted. I spend a lot of time on the road going out to meet our farmers and ranchers. So my slides today reflect kind of my views as I not only see the data, but also as I'm out in the market trying to apply that data. And as I'm out there, I've thought a lot about this quote on the next slide here. It's a common one that you've probably seen before from Donald Rumsfeld, that there's known knowns, there's things that we know that we don't know, there's all sorts of knowns and unknowns. And I thought Amanda did a great job of kind of highlighting a lot of those knowns and unknowns that are out there right now. And Sherry too, when she mentioned some of the consumer confidence numbers that we've seen as we're working through this idea of what do we know, what's certain, and what's not certain. I think this is a good exercise to think through. And on this next slide, you can see I spent some time just thinking about what are the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown knowns, the unknown unknowns for agriculture. This probably took me longer than I care to admit, but really sitting down and trying to think about what risks are, what opportunities are, what do we know that's true, such as farm incomes in decline. Maybe that's excluding the cattle industry. Maybe it's rural labor force shrinking, water scarcity. What are some things that we know that there's some unknown around, as Amanda highlighted with trade policy, or maybe it's the decline in acres? What are things that we subconsciously know, but that aren't at the forefront of our minds? So maybe it's global demographics or the value added, which Amanda again highlighted. And then there's, of course, the things that we don't know what's out there. And I put question marks around some of these that are things right now that are actually probably known unknowns, but something, the black swans, so to speak, that are circling, that are out there. You'll notice I highlighted 3 of these in yellow, which are the 3 topics I'd like to talk about today, which is tightening liquidity and balance sheets on the farm level as a known known, in my view. The unknown known, so some things that are in our subconscious that we know about, but maybe we haven't fully fleshed out, would be global demographics and the massive changes that we're seeing globally, which will impact us here in the US. And then sort of this idea of the priority of value added. And I'm going to expand on a little bit of what Amanda touched on there at the end. So let's start with this next slide and the idea of balance sheets tightening. I think here, because if you look at the USDA data, they would actually show a slight improvement in some of our balance sheet metrics, such as a debt to asset ratio, for example. Now there's going to be revisions to that, so we'll see going forward where that heads. But I typically think about balance sheets from the aspect of farmland. So farmland makes up about 84-ish% of our assets, about 2/3 of our total debt. So as you see farmland values increase faster than the debt on it increase, typically you have a net equity increase. So what you're looking at here is 3 surveys from the Kansas City Fed, Minneapolis Fed, and the Chicago Fed. And all I'm simply doing is taking the net increase in farmland values against the increase in farmland debt. Another way to say this is anytime that those lines are below zero, you have a scenario where your net equity is in decline. Obviously, many on here would relate to the fact that over the last probably 4-ish years, we've had a really, really strong run in balance sheet building, where farmland values have significantly increased in value, as had equipment for a period of time, which we'll talk about later. And as a result, we had a very strong building of our balance sheet. Similar, though maybe not as severe as we had from probably about 2011 through 2013, a period in which ethanol was front and foremost. We had extremely high commodity prices. We had zero interest rates. We had altogether a very strong ag economy. However, as I look at the data coming in, I think it's clear that farmland values have flattened. You can see here the Fed values have flattened by most of these surveys or gone slightly negative. Additionally, if you would look out at surveys that Farm Credit puts together, Farm Credit Service America has a very a robust survey that you can find on their website. Most land values across the Midwest have certainly flattened. Also, if you were to go out to Central Valley of California, their land values have been in decline for quite some time, driven large part by water scarcity, also driven by issues with the tree nut industry and tree fruit industry. On top of that, we've had a period of rising farmland debt. As a result, you can see that arrow there pointing to the last quarter here where we have a decline in net equity positions. As I look and talk to lenders, and as I work with farmland owners, and as I work with farmers out in the country, this is probably the reality that many of them are facing. They've got a period of tight liquidity. Most cash flows for major grains and tree nuts are still negative to break even, and you have a period of tightening balance sheets. I've highlighted here in gray the periods of, the times in which our last farmland or last farm bills were passed. You'll notice that going into this farm bill discussion, we're very close to that 2014 period where we have a declining market, a period of tightening balance sheets, a period of liquidity that is tightening quick. But we're coming off several years of very good profits and balance sheet strengthening. So as I think about the implication here for the Farm Bill, it's going to have to be forward looking. It's going to have to be forward thinking in the direction that we're headed. If we were to pass a bill that is more similar to kind of that 08 period when we were at the top, it would probably miss some of the struggles that are out there that farmers are currently facing. Along with that, I think the ag industry in general has a major paradigm shift coming. On the next slide, you can see probably the biggest paradigm shift that I feel that the ag industry needs to think through. And that's this idea of the global demographics and the idea that the feed the world paradigm is probably slowing. So if you're like me, most all of your mid-90s to early 2000 extension meetings, farm conference meetings were etched into your mind this idea of feeding the world. We had constant conversations about this rising global population. We had constant conversations about rising incomes, this idea of globalization, that we were going to export a very large percentage of our crops, more so than we had ever had before. And in doing so, we'd feed the world and gain our balance sheets. For the most part, that worked. For the most part, most commodities have increased their export volume, if not dollars. And over time, we've seen a significant improvement in cash income from exports. However, I think we're probably at a period of time in which that paradigm is played out. So if you look at that green line, that's the US, or that's the global population. It's the UN projections of global population. And it wasn't long ago, maybe 15 plus years ago, that we still thought global populations were going to increase for a very long time. However, over the last several years, we've started to see very, very rapidly declining fertility rates, and you've seen the UN start to lower their estimates of global population. When Terrain looked at this, our analyst Matt Wolf, and this is all on our website, terrainag.com, if you want to really get into the weeds, he looked at it and he estimates our global population will peak in 2065 at less than 10 billion people. It wasn't long ago that we were talking about a global peak of about 10.5 billion. It wasn't long before that we were talking about global peaks around 12 billion. You think about the contraction, that's a major difference in total calories consumed. It's a major difference in total export market and market share availability. I would also highlight, though 2065 seems like a long time out, consider too that we're only 40-ish years from that period of time. An orchard, a regular almond orchard may last 30-ish years. A pistachio orchard would last a lot longer than that. A 30-year farm bill or 30-year farm note, would start to expire close to that 2065 period. So while it seems a long ways out, most agricultural families are thinking generationally. We're thinking long term. This will be a reality that many of us are going to start to think through, of a declining global population. For agriculture, the next slide I think highlights this well, and Amanda touched on it a little bit, of who are our key trade partners. Obviously, you've got Canada and Mexico kind of at the top rung there. You've also got China, South Korea, and Japan, who make up kind of that top 5 historically. Now, Japan, South Korea, and China have already peaked on their population. They are past peak of population. There will be in a declining population and an aging population. Much of Europe is already in that scenario too, of both peaked and aging population. Not too long from now, Mexico and Canada will be joining that group. You've got North America here, and I put it in Latin America here. This is UN numbers. You're looking kind of mid 2050s to into the 2060 period of declining populations or peak population. This is pretty significant if you think about total percentage of our exports, but also if you think about where we don't export. So you see Africa there, their peak is sometime post 2100. It's, in other words, it's way out there. Even using, this is the Lowe variant numbers for the UN, which applies very closely to what Terrain believes we're going to hit. We don't export a lot to Africa. A very, very small percentage of our exports go to Africa. A lot of the global growth too in the near term will be driven by India. Again, a country that we export very, very little to. So as I think about global populations, one very key change is going to be a change in trade partners or a shift in trade partners. It won't be immediate. It won't be fast. But I do think you're going to start hearing more discussion about trade missions to Africa. You're going to start hearing about what markets some of the Indian consumers would like, what markets some of our African nations would benefit from, and how our trade would benefit from them as well. Additionally, you're going to hear a lot more about what do aging populations consume? What do aging populations that are also increasing in per capita GDP or general forms of wealth, what do they consume relative to today? That will probably be the biggest paradigm shift in the next 30-ish years that I see agriculture going through. The next slide, I think, highlights how big of a shift we're talking about. This is simply looking at live births per woman, or a measure of fertility rates during her lifetime, by export commodity partners. So the way to read this is the purple line there is wheat. I took all of our wheat partners and I weighted their fertility rates by our share of exports that we send to them. That red line there is just above 2 live births per woman, which is roughly what I would call replacement ratio, or the UN's replacement ratio. You'll notice those gray bars are periods, again, of farm bills. This will be the first farm bill that we have ever done where the fertility rate for our major commodities is below the replacement rate. Meaning, over the next 4, 5, 10 years, or however long this farm bill stretches, we are looking at an environment where the population will be aging and global growth will be slowing. Doesn't mean we will all be at peak, but it will be slowing. So we'll have to have a farm bill that's thinking more carefully about crafting new markets. So whether that's Africa, whether that's trying to break through some of the trade barriers in India, whether that's thinking about new products, but also too, just thinking about how do we improve local domestic consumption as well. If your cost of production is in dollars, it obviously makes sense to sell in dollars as much as you can. And I thought Amanda's chart there on what we produce, what we import, what we export was a very apt measure of that as well. What I think you're going to hear more about, and it's the very, I thought, really good opportunity that Amanda pointed out. We did not coordinate this ahead of time, though I wish we had. It would have been great. Was the idea of value added or high value products. This next slide gives you an idea of how often we think about value add or high value products in terms of what we consume. So maybe we've got some high value flour, or maybe we've got the beef industry, which has a large chunk of that carcass moving towards what I would call a luxury demand, not commodity based. But two, it applies to exports. So the way to think about this is look at corn back in 1990. This is a breakout of their exports. 1990, more than 80% of our corn was exported as bulk. Today, only about 60% of our corn is exported as bulk, and 40% are these really high value products, whether that's the brands, whether that's the oils, whether that's ethanol, whether that's DDGs, whether that's the syrups and the fructose, Canada being a huge outlet for a lot of those. It has shifted the value for the corn industry quite significantly. I think you're going to see more and more conversation about that, whether it's building out soy crush capacity or whether it's about individual markets that you'll see moving forward. So let's wrap this up real quick on the last slide. Be sensitive of time. I do think you see balance sheets tightening. It's the most likely scenario to me, which means we need to have a long-term safety network that is forward-looking, not backwards-looking on the last 4 years. Need to have a change here in feeding the world paradigm, meaning new partners, whether that's the Foreign Market Development Program or others. And finally, we'll have this kind of product switch where products will be the forefront, not bulk. Products will be the forefront, not bulk. So whether that's on biofuels or high product development will be the key implications for the Farm Bill. I'm going to stop there. Happy to answer any Q&A. You can follow us there on LinkedIn, if you will. And thanks again for having me, Sherry, and others.
Matt, thank you so much for that. I've been following your work on that peak population, and I think that's a really challenging thing to think about when we're sometimes struggling in the short term, but it's always important to be also looking to the medium term and longer term. So I'll look forward in our conversation later to unpack a little bit more about that in terms of what it might mean from a policy standpoint, how farmers should be thinking about that as we try to, it takes us a while to pivot our strategies on farms. So look forward to digging into that a little bit more. So next up we have Jim Lowe, who is an Associate Dean of Online Programs and Extension and Professor of Veterinary Clinical Medicine at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In addition, he maintains a consulting practice advising 25% of U.S. beef cattle marketers, top swine producers in North America, and pork and beef producers globally, including in Europe, Australia, the Middle East, and Asia. He sounds like a busy man. He is the co-coordinator of the Executive Veterinary Program in Swine Health Management and the co-developer and coordinator of both the Executive Pork Producers Program and the EVP Program in Beef Health Management. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. I did hear from some of our hog producers across Farm Foundation, and I know we will all value your insights today. So over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Sherry, and certainly thanks for the opportunity today to share some news. And so we're going to chat about animal health, and I don't have slides because I think it's a narrative story that's been interesting. We're going to try to weave through here. So we have really two kind of key topics today as we think about the economics facing the industry. One of those is this story about HPAI, or high pathogenic avian influenza. And the other's a little about ASF. And so we're going to spend most of our time talking about, excuse me, I'm fighting the end of a cold. Flu, and that fits actually within our research group. So we spend a fair amount of time looking at influenza at the human had been swine interface, but thinking about how do these viruses transmit between species. And now we've obviously branched out with this in the news to do the avian side. So a little bit of background on influenza, just so you get, it's a bunch of lingo and a bunch of letters, but we'll try to break this down. When we think about flu, there are two main types of influenza. One is avian influenza, which really infects birds and is primarily in the wildfowl or waterfowl population. So it migrates with ducks as they migrate north and south, and we think about that globally, and we think about that migration pattern from the Arctic to South America and back to Arctic. So as they come south in the fall, they bring viruses with them, and as they go north, they go back to the north in the spring, lay chicks up there, we get recirculation of virus. So within avian flu, there are really two types, and the vast majority of those influenza viruses are what we would call lowly pathogenic, or those viruses don't kill domestic poultry. None of the viruses are particularly virulent in ducks and geese. So they are in shorebirds. So they the viruses circulate within the waterfowl population. Occasionally, we get the emergence of a high path one that will kill domestic poultry, and that starts to escape into our domestic poultry. And this happens every so often. And so this high path, low path thing is really just how bad or how much disease does the virus cause. So we would normally see a high path virus emerge, and we saw this in 2014. High path virus emerges as the birds migrate south in the fall. That virus escapes in domestic poultry. We get die-offs in domestic poultry, and we'll talk about the government, our policy response to that. And then as the birds go south, they overwinter, they build immunity, the susceptible birds die off as they fly north. They might reinfect a few, but that virus dies out. So it's one migration season. And that's historically what we've seen with high-path viruses. And so this year, well, really 3 years ago, we saw that happen with this H5N1 variant, or H5N1 times genotype we have now. But then the next year, the same thing happened. So the virus didn't die out in the waterfowl population. So as these birds migrated 2 falls in a row, and now we're in our 3rd fall in a row, that we have got circulation of this, what is our current H5N1, floating around in the population and infecting domestic poultry flocks. And so that's really what's different in this case, is that we've seen this sustained transmission of this virus beyond what we would normally expect, without really immunity occurring and it dying off in the waterfowl population. So at this point, I'm not an avian flu expert. I think mostly about the other kind of flu, which is mammal flu, which is people and pig flu. I think mostly about that, but the avian people are considering at this point that virus to be endemic, meaning that that virus isn't going to go away. So we don't think that this current round of HPAI is going to go away, and we're going to continue to have spillover events from domestic or from waterfowl into domestic poultry. And this is significant when we think about what we do from a control standpoint. So that's different, and that's what's going on, and it's sustained and it's been happening. And then the real wild card and where we got involved was about a year ago in December of 23, but we really found it in the spring of 24. We had one of these avian viruses spill over into cattle, and primarily in dairy cattle in Texas. And subsequently, you think it's much more than just dairy cattle, but it's been just dairy cattle at this point. And so because of the vagaries or the mechanism, not vagaries, the mechanisms of how the dairy industry works, that virus happened to infect some herds in Texas. But we put a lot of heifers in Texas, and we grow a lot of heifers in Texas and breed those heifers in Texas, and then move those heifers to, after calving, it comes to find out, up to herds in the rest of the country, California, and primarily in the Midwest. So a lot of Midwestern milk herds, milking strings, are actually sourced out of heifer populations in this as wet heifers or Springer heifers out of the Southwest in the Texas Panhandle, New Mexico area. So we got virus in there, and then we very quickly distributed that virus across the U.S. dairy industry. And right, we've infected, I've lost count on the herds, but really we've had many states. Illinois actually has been spared a bit because we're not quite part of that network. We're not a very big dairy state, or at least that part of dairy state, but Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, that neck of the woods has all been infected. And then we've had some in New York, and then really hit hard in California. And so in Idaho, et cetera. So as we move the virus around, that has happened in the dairy industry. Now, we've got two very different policy and economic responses to those things. So high-path avian influenza is a trade concern in the poultry business. Countries that are endemically infected with high-path avian influenza generally are barred from export. And so it's sanitary and phytosanitary measures to control trade. So we don't want to spread this disease around. So we have in the U.S. had a policy in poultry, and it's actually encoded in the NPIP, the National Poultry Improvement Federation program, NPIP program, which is federal law, that we're going to stomp that disease out. So that means when a flock is infected, we go eradicate that. We euthanize that flock to eradicate that disease, and that's our official policy. We have an indemnity program, so we pay those owners of that flock to get rid of those birds, and then they would restock that after a period of downtime to clean the flock up. That's official policy there, and that's really centered around trade. In the dairy industry, it's not a program disease, meaning USDA has no jurisdiction, and they can put general disease control in, but there's no indemnity program, there's no control process, and so the dairy thing has basically been left for the industry to manage, and that's fine. They've not made many changes, nor have we understood a lot. I think we're actually a little behind there. I mean, from a science standpoint, we've probably don't know what we should know a year into an outbreak. But the dairy thing is kind of the dairy thing, and it's obviously not very good for the cows because the cows really do get sick and the herd production does drop. But those herds recover, and we have a lot of relatively excess dairy capacity in this country. So we produce a lot of milk. The dairy thing is interesting, and the dairy thing is devastating for individual dairy farms, but as an industry and a policy standpoint, it's not been that critically important. So let's go back to where the policy and the economics are important, which is in the avian space. And so the avian flocks, or the commercial poultry flocks, have primarily been turkeys, but really layer flocks have been afflicted in this country. And that's partially because where the layers are located. So the layers in the upper Midwest, right in the middle of these flyways, are getting infected at a fairly high rate. And the layer complexes tend to be huge. So when we depop a flock, it's a really big flock. We're depopulating, right? Hundreds of thousands of birds, not a few birds. The broilers have not been infected. They're primarily in the southeast, out of the flyways, and in a region that we've not historically seen much avian influenza in, or high path or low path. So a different population there. So if we think back to what happened, and this has been 10, 12 years ago, right? We made this shift in that industry to cage-free eggs. That was a big thing. McDonald's famously came out and said, we're only buying cage-free eggs, and then couldn't get the supply and had to back off of that pledge. And that's kind of the beginning of this. And so then everybody geared up like crazy, and we built a tremendous number of layer flocks, housing for layer flocks in this cage-free or non-battery cage environments, and they've got different names for those things. So we've added a lot of layer capacity because of this need for an alternative housing system. What that led to is actually we probably got excess layer capacity in this country, significant excess layer capacity, because of all these new houses that got built without really a growing demand. And so it was not that long ago that we were paying less than $1 a dozen for eggs at our local Aldi, and that's below the cost of production. And so the industry was oversupplied, overcapacitated. Actually, cage-free eggs at one point were cheaper than battery cage eggs because they were producing so many of them, they couldn't make that market. They were just sliding back into the regular channel. And so you've had this industry that wasn't overly profitable because they were slightly overproducing. And right, we've got a lot of price elasticity. Well, like porcine epidemic diarrhea virus in 2014 in the pig industry, which hit individual herds, and we wiped out individual herds for a short period of time. The entire industry wasn't hit at the same time, so we reduced production, and we saw the highest pig prices we've ever seen. It was the most profitable year in pig farming, 14-15, that we've ever had. It was almost obscene because of this piece of price elasticity. We cut back market supply just a little bit, 8-10%, and that just absolutely drove the thing through the roof in terms of price. Well, if you see what's happening today in the poultry business, in the layer business, that's basically what's happening. We've cut supply back a little bit. That cut back in supply a little bit has actually led to really these $6 a dozen eggs in the marketplace. Quite frankly, I think poultry producers are cashing the checks and kind of enjoying it. So, and that's just how the market works, right? So I think profitability, yes, individual flocks are being devastated, but in terms of output of that, it's been extremely profitable. So I don't think that's going to move particularly in any way. As we think about policy and what's going to happen, our solution would be vaccination to that. USDA to date and reaffirmed that last week that vaccination is basically off the table because it doesn't produce sterilizing immunity. So influenza in birds, just like influenza vaccine in people, it makes it less severe disease, but it does not eradicate it. And because of that lack of eradication, the lack of sterilizing immunity, they are unwilling to let us vaccinate because they think it'll make it endemic and damage our long-term trade. So there doesn't appear to be a short-term solution. USDA has put out a $500 million allocation here for the poultry industry to deal with this here in the last 2 or 3 weeks. 100 million of that is for vaccines, primarily to work on, can we build a sterilizing immunity vaccine? Probably not likely given our current technology, and really $400 million for producers for biosecurity. So that's yet to be seen how that's going to be spent, and what's going to be happen, what the impact of that is. I think those of us in the space view that that's probably not going to have much impact on egg price, but that's clearly where that's at. So as we think about this, I don't think the egg thing is going to change. It's really good for egg producers. They're making a ton of money right now, which had not been the case. They're building equity, maybe not quite as fast as cow-calf guys, but certainly faster than some of the rest of us in the red meat industries. And so we'll see what this looks like. We don't have any indication that it's going to go away. So this might kind of be the new normal as we're thinking about from a supply demand standpoint. And obviously, high prices, the only thing that cures high prices is high prices, right? And so we'll probably bring some production on if they continue to be this profitable. But I am certainly not an egg guy expert. The other one very quickly is African swine fever. And if we were doing this a year ago or 18 months ago, that's all we'd have talked about. So African swine fever is a virus that infects pigs and only infects pigs. It was a very hot topic in terms of rapid global spread 3 years ago. Massive outbreaks in Asia and really across Europe. That has quieted down. That's another disease that if we have an outbreak in the United States, it will be absolutely devastating to pork producers. We export about 30% of the value of a carcass today. If we think of a 2.5 or 3 to 1 price elasticity piece, we lose 30% of our value. You could see prices approaching zero. And I think that's probably not unrealistic in the short term. The industry has been very proactive and has established a program called U.S. Swine Health Improvement Program, or U.S. SHIP. That has been officially made a USDA program here last fall, really with Roger Main's leadership at Iowa State, to move that forward. That is a control plan. We've got some movement in there, and the idea is how could we get to compartmentalization or identify where that infection is at and segregate plants, so positive, negative plants, to be able to maintain some export market. And that is moving along. But I think from a threat standpoint, we can't let our guard down. But I think it's a very, very different situation than a year ago. And I'm not sure from a risk mitigation or policy standpoint, we're that excited about it. So that's kind of the big topics in animal health, animal production, live animal production today as we think about risk with respect to profitability and long-term outlook.
Great, Jim. Thank you so much. You even hit on some of the questions I had from some of our farmer network, especially like on the policy side and disease control strategies. So hopefully we'll get some more questions from the floor, but thank you so much for those insights. And at the moment, we will pivot over to a crop insurance lens. And just a big shout out to Joanie Grimes, our next speaker. She stepped up in the last 24 hours to step in to talk about crop insurance when our previous speaker had some travel woes. So Joanie, just really, I'm grateful for you being here today. So Joanie Grimes is an agent with ICAP. Joanie specializes in crop and livestock insurance, helping farmers and ranchers manage risk and protect their operations. With a deep passion for serving the farming community, Joanie has dedicated her career to supporting agricultural producers. She has been actively involved in industry leadership, including serving as a committee chair on the Crop Insurance Professionals Association board, speaking at college classes, and contributing to various agricultural events. Joanie also, importantly, operates a cattle and forage business near Hillsboro, Ohio, specializing in merchandising elite seed stock cattle to producers across the nation. So Joanie, really look forward to your insights a little bit closer to the farm level. So Joanie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I'm excited about it. We just came off of, most of the country just finished as of yesterday, our sales closing for the spring crops that are getting ready to be planted here very soon throughout the Midwest. My experience is mainly more in corn, soybeans with some wheat, much like the Midwest. This year was a very interesting year, and I really didn't know what to expect. Whenever you go into a sales closing, it's the farmers let you know what they're thinking, and usually you see different trends. And since we were getting pressure from the markets, and we all knew that there was not a lot of margin in the crop that we would be producing for 2025, I was interested to see how my producers would approach it. And I was very surprised. I shouldn't say surprised, but I was comforted to know that they didn't take crop insurance as part of something that they were going to put on the chopping block and try to save a few dollars for. Quite frankly, I saw the exact opposite. And I didn't have but just a handful of producers that changed as far as reducing coverage. Their main goal was to make sure that they tried to cover their production cost. And as some of you guys well know, in some areas that was very difficult to do this year. There was some things that I think crop insurance is definitely on solid footing. While we will continue to have challenges, just like every part of agriculture, the private-public relationship that we experience through crop insurance, I think, is on solid footing. And we have very good rapport with RMA and working to try to better the producers that we deal with. I think there were some things that happened this year that probably had more to do with it than that had to do with shoring things up, and that was some increase in some subsidy levels for some products that gave some more tools in the toolbox for the producer to be able to utilize. That is one thing that we definitely see an increase or a trend in the industry, is that a push to try to maybe not increase subsidies, but redistribute and be able to have the producer that wants to use crop insurance as a true backstop and risk management and a market backstop, that they be able to do that and not be penalized for carrying higher levels of coverage. And this year was one of the strongest years that I saw that the producer definitely wanted to use it as a market backstop. I do not believe that while there are a percentage of the 2025 crops sold, I believe everybody is a little nervous for what we may be looking at in the future and wanted to be able to protect as much of their production as they could. Another area, and I think part of that too is, I think the goal for crop insurance as we look forward in our crystal balls is to try to be able to make these programs more advantageous for producers so we can lessen the need for ad hoc disaster, being able to do better planning, be able to know what we would be expecting and not have to have large influxes of cash to be able to sustain the production portion of, especially in the corn, soybean, and wheat realm. The things that I kind of see in crop insurance or just the multi-peril insurance as well that RMA works with is the livestock sector is expanding tremendously, as well as the dairy. Personally, we do not have much dairy in the area, so we don't have much dairy that we work with, but the livestock is something that through education, through the RMA and through the industry and agents is really beginning to take hold. And while it is a way to be able to put a floor under your livestock, whether it be cow-calf, where it be the calves or fed cattle, is really starting to get some traction. I believe we'll probably see new products spawn off of those different coverages. And I see that we'll have some different coverages, I think, I know that there's some in the pipeline. I am privileged to chair a committee through our National Agents Association on working on new products and vetting products that are in the pipeline to come out to help benefit all producers. So I think we'll see some expanded coverages in the livestock sector, whether it be pork or beef, as well as dairy. And I also, the thing that I believe will continue to be a trend in the industry is just the expansion of new products and private products. That is one way that these AIPs can differentiate themselves in the industry. And I do believe that there's a definite need for private products because that seems to be the feeding ground for where we have expansion in the risk management area. For instance, ECO, which was a very popular coverage this year for producers where they could insure shallow losses and give them the extra dollars that they needed to cover their production cost. That started as a private product, and the companies that developed it basically worked with RMA to make that part of a subsidized product that the producers could utilize. And I believe that we're going to see more and more of that as we continue to go forward. I believe that there will also be some expansion and not just in revenue, but perhaps trying to expand to where instead of looking at a whole farm type, have a more whole farm type program that doesn't have to be so diverse for someone to take advantage of it, to where it would perhaps have more utilization for corn, soybeans, and wheat, and being able to shore up the whole operation instead of having it segmented into crops. I believe that there will be a lot of changes or at least discussion in subsidies and how those are distributed. And I think part of it will perhaps come through the Farm Bill as we start to look forward to help set a basis for things that we'll be looking at. But it's definitely, while it is a mature market, it is a market that I believe for the first time in probably 15 years, the producers, a vast number of the producers are really being able to be creative with the tools that we have out there and fit their own products or their own plan to the products that we have and be able to meet the needs of ranging producers that are out there. It is something that will continue to expand upon. And we're kind of excited to see what comes in the pipeline in the next 2 or 3 years. With that, that's about all we see on the crop insurance sector at this point, but I'd welcome any questions that somebody may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanie. I know that, in our farming operation in my lifetime, we have really dramatically changed how we use those tools. And I think that's going to be the future as well. It's such a critical tool for producers of all kinds as much as possible. I do have some follow-up questions and look forward to more as we engage in the Q&A session soon. Thanks so much, Joanie. So our next speaker is Kanlaya Barr. Kanlaya is a Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellow and is the Director of Corporate Economics at John Deere, leading a global team focused on agriculture and construction economics. Her prior roles include lead economist for agriculture, senior economist, credit risk analytics lead, and economist for Latin America, where Kanlaya built forecasting models and provided economic insights. Kanlaya, thanks so much for being with us and look forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you to Farm Foundation for this great opportunity to join you today. And also thank you, everyone, for calling in. I know everybody's busy, so thank you for taking time off your schedule. Next slide, please. And Amanda talks a lot about trade and how the experience that we're going through today, and Matt talked about the balance sheet is tightening and demand is going forward is going to be slowing down, as well as the population growth is peak in some places and forecast to peak in the next few decades here. And what I'm showing here today is another picture on the supply side. Not only now we are seeing that tailwind is not as fast as it had been, also on the supply side, we are also seeing more competitors coming into the landscape as well. If you look at the red line, that's the acreage for principal crops in the US. That's compared between the early 2000s until the last few years here. You can see that is mostly stabilized, increased a little bit, but mostly stabilized. That's in Europe, is kind of coming down. The acreage is coming down a little bit. But at the same time, we also see that growing acreage expansion coming in from Brazil, and that's including the safrinha corn or second corn crop as well. Growing expansion coming in from Russia and also Ukraine, the Black Sea market. So those are where the landscape is going to continue to be competitive for the market globally, for agricultural market. Next slide, please. And when it comes down to what do we think about in terms of farmers, how are economics working out, or what kind of equipment demand we might expect to see this year, you can see that if you look at from the headline number, this is the number of the farm sector profitability, the farm income and net cash farm income that is released by USDA back in February. And you can see that, oh, maybe what are we talking about here? Why are we thinking the farmers is in, the low margin? Because this headline number is looking like we are increasing in farm income, right? Year over year, farm income is increasing 20%, over 20% here. But the detail is we have to look at this from a more detailed level, because if you go to the next slide, please, when you look at the farm economy, there are the stories of divergence in farm income. Many speakers before me have talked about the livestock where cow-calf price is very high. When you look at the protein price, the egg price is also very high. So if you look at from the livestock perspective, those are the sector in the farm economy today that is still doing pretty well. Compared to last year in 2024, USDA right now forecasting that revenue or the cash receipt from the livestock sector is coming down a little bit. But if you look at from where they have been, it's still quite a bit higher than a few years ago. So on the livestock segment side, yes, the livestock ranchers and producers are doing rather well compared to what they have been doing a few years ago. Next slide, please. But if you look at from the row crop perspective, I think things are looking a little bit more challenging. The green line here, that's representing the crop prices over time. And as you can see, back even in 2012, 2013, when we saw those crop prices start to come down, if you look at the input cost, which is the red line there, look what happened to the input cost. It didn't come down as fast, right? So farmers' margins were pressured back then during that trough cycle. And if you look at what's happening over the past couple of years, crop prices went up and the crop prices has come down over 30%. But where do we see the input prices? Is coming down maybe less than 5%. So what does that mean? That means farmers' margins are continuing to be pressured because of these declining crop prices, and input prices just a little bit more sticky. Next slide, please. And as you can see here, USDA continue to forecast if we have a trend yield. If we have a trend yield, we'll see the crop prices continue to be stabilizing at this lower level. USDA forecasting from the Ag Outlook Forum last month, looking at corn in the low $4 and soybeans in the $10. Again, there's still a lot of uncertainties out there. We still have to deal with the weather in South America, deal with the weather in the US. So there's still a lot of things can change. But if we have a trend yield, a normal growing season, we would expect, USDA would expect price to kind of moderate at this low level. Next slide, please. And therefore, when you combine that between the sticky input price, the low crop prices here, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has put out the farmer expectation for the margins for the next crop year, which is the last bar there. And as you can see, that farmers' margins is forecasted to continue to be pressured because of that low crop prices and also the high input cost. Again, I have to emphasize that this is based on the trend yield assumption. And that is true for both corn and soybean. And back to Joanie's point, that it's continued to be important for farmers to make sure that you are looking into the risk management and make sure that you are on top of, looking at what's going on in your portfolio. Next slide, please. And the other part, when we talk about the farm income is high because of livestock, producers are still looking at the good receipts. The row crop producers are experiencing that pressure margins. And the other piece that also lead to that higher farm income is from the direct government payments. You can see that Amanda touched a little bit more already, that during 2018, we have that support for the trade facilitation program. We have a couple of years of COVID, 2020 and 2021. And now we saw as a part of the American Relief Act of 2025, we have seen, that was passed last year. In that part, you're going to have the government authorized $10 billion of economic assistance for farmers and also $21 billion of disaster aid for producers. We haven't seen the money coming into the producers quite yet, but hopefully we'll see that coming in soon. So that's kind of a part that would help. It is very crucial program that would help farmers stabilizing their farm income, and that's very crucial, especially in this time of the high economic uncertainties and also with the low crop prices as well. Next slide, please. And if you look at from these fundamentals perspective, right, we have lower prices. We have input costs still stubbornly more elevated, and margins is low. You look at from industry outlook here, from North America, US and Canada, we expect that the machinery industry outlook to be down compared to last year, down 30% because of that uncertainty, because of that low farmers margin. And also that spread into the small ag and turf equipment as well. But the other point we want to look at is if you look at from the equipment perspective around the world, in Europe, in South America, we have seen that market is more stabilized elsewhere. In South America, the market is stabilized compared to, down 30% in the US, is because they have a better crop this year, and also with weakening reais, their currency is weakening. Therefore, when you sell the crops into domestic currency, you actually make more money. So therefore, the margin is better. So we expect the industry to kind of be about flattish in South America as when we compare to a significant decline in North America. What does that mean for farmers? I want to end with a good picture on, while we see these are challenging time with low prices, sticky costs, low margins, price volatilities, we have policy uncertainties, we have tariffs, but there are also opportunity as well, because you look at many forums I have been to, talked about the trade initiatives. We talked about how the focus would be shifting into the area where the population growth is in South America, in South Africa, or also in Asia. And also with the livestock right now, the livestock producers, we have seen the smallest herd cattle over 60 years for the cattle herd. But in the next few years, we expect to see those herd rebuilding, and that's going to translate to more feed demand as well. So I think those are also opportunities. And then finally, when it comes to, yes, this is a time for farmers with low margins, but I think leaning on technology also helping farmers with their lower costs as well. Next slide, please. And if you look at from the technology standpoint, there are many technologies out there, and I'm just showing you what we have as John Deere portfolio that can help farmers be able to leverage this technology that some of you might already have access to it, and be able to use the technology to help you produce, improve your efficiency, productivity, and also be able to lower the cost as well. Next slide, please. And with this technology, if you, from our the model farm perspective, is allow you to be able to save costs up to almost $50 per acre from our model farm, and also be able to reduce greenhouse gas emission and be able to help address from the labor and cost standpoint as well. So I think while there are some challenges, macro that you cannot control, I also think it's great for us to also be able to control and do things that we can from the risk management standpoint, and also from leaning on into technology that we have on farm. And those allow us to be able to help reducing costs in this low margin environment. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity today to be with you, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Galia. And we will look to now engage in a discussion across the panel. Thank you to each of you for sharing your particular lens and insights at this time as we look at the State of the Union. I'm going to try to take some of the questions from Q&A and in the section here that people have submitted, and then have some from the farmers that I reached out to in advance too. I think there has been some interest in the question that's in the Q&A on BRICS. So I think we'll start with that one first. And I invite any of you who wish to comment on this question to engage. But Amanda, I think we'll start with you. The question is, as a leading member of BRICS, Brazil continues to expand its agricultural exports, often undercutting U.S. producers in key markets like China. How should U.S. policymakers and industry leaders respond to maintain competitiveness, especially in light of shifting trade alliances and Brazil's lower production costs? Amanda.
Thank you, Sherry, and thanks for that really great question. So I think, it's really challenging, and this really does come back to this concept of comparative advantage, right? And we know that Brazil, again, I mentioned this already, several folks have mentioned this already, that Brazil really is an agricultural powerhouse as well. And so I think it's important for the US to really lean into what we're relatively good at. So when I think about, Galia just mentioned technology and innovation. That's really important. Another key topic that comes to mind is infrastructure. And so, when I visited Brazil for the first time about 15 years ago, and I thought, we're going to see these huge infrastructure improvements in Brazil. And I would have expected that to have improved even more than it has already. And so I think it's important to keep in mind continual investments in research and technology and innovation, investments in infrastructure, and then also, as Matt and a few others also did touch on already, is this idea of value added. So again, I think leaning in on what we're relatively good at, focusing on technology and innovation, infrastructure improvements, and also high value added products are how the U.S. can continue to be competitive. And also, Matt touched on this and a few others did as well, just about the importance of exploring new trade partners and new market access. And so when we think about it, more than half of our agricultural trade, both on the import and export sides, occurs with our top 3 trade partners. And our top 5 trade partners comprise the majority of things that we trade. And so I think it's going to be really important to be proactive in exploring new trade partners. And that's something that we do quite a bit of work on, is the concept of, gaining market share and then potentially losing market share. And so as we enter an era of challenging trade policy, we really have to keep the long game in mind, and that when you lose access to a market or you lose market share, it can be extremely difficult to recapture because of the strength that supply chains have and what and these relationships that are cultivated across supply chains. So I think keeping that in mind is also really important. So that's my hot take on how can we compete with Brazil, especially in an era when Brazil has relatively lower production costs. I think finding ways to lean in on what we're relatively good at and explore new opportunities is going to be paramount.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think, Matt, you had some comments on that question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, and great comments, Amanda. BRICS was probably the top question I was asked during my fall and winter tour of farmers with farm credit. So I wrote a little article out on our website. I'll drop it in the chat. But a few things that I would add on to Amanda's comments. I would say we need to take BRICS seriously, and I say that for two reasons. One, if you stack up all the countries that are in BRICS officially or partners or in some sort of membership state, their GDP is bigger than our US, Canada, Mexico GDP combined, and their population is massive. It's a huge percentage of global population. So we need to take them seriously. It is a challenge. However, if you take all of their consumption against all of their production, they are still as a group, a net importer of most, not all, but most of our key commodities. That could change as Brazil ramps up production, which Amanda and I think Galia both did a really good job of talking about. That could change. There's global population dynamics that I highlighted and others. But as they seek to fulfill sort of a smaller circle of trade partners, to Amanda's point, there's going to be new opportunities as well, whether that's Europe or whether that's Africa or wherever that's going to be. There will be a supply gap for us to jump into, and I'll drop that in there. There's a lot more in terms of exchange rates and currency and other topics we could get in there. But great question on the BRICS side.
Thank you. I'm going to stay here for a little bit and weave in some of the farmer questions before we move on to a different topic. This is one that I heard from on our farmers. And I think in some ways it's like an existential question of, so what is the role of the U.S. ag sector in the world as we look ahead? What was our comparative advantage? What does our comparative advantage need to be over the next 10 years? And I'm just going to read directly one of the comments from one of the farmers. How do farmers in the U.S. survive as residual suppliers to the world? We are no longer the #1 supplier of all major commodities, with the exception of corn, and Brazil is gaining. China is not buying from us, so where do we sell? How do we store as we try to make these pivots? And what or where are the new markets? So I wanted to stay there a little bit more, maybe talk about the storage question as well, and then talk about where do you see some of the new market opportunities? Some of these pivots can be done swiftly, others take a little bit of time. Where do you see some of the short-term new market opportunities and the longer-term market opportunities? Amanda, can I go back to you to kick off that one?
Sure. Thanks, Sherry. Matt touched on this a bit. We think about India, who is a really important player in the world market, but we don't export a lot to. I think that's a huge opportunity. Matt already talked about that quite a bit. But this also goes back to the idea of when we think about the changing landscape of U.S. agriculture and global agriculture, I do think that we want to really highlight the importance of thinking about value added. And so when you're competing in the bulk commodity space, and it's difficult to compete on price, when we look at the United States, we have really high input costs. Galia had a really nice figure that showed decreasing commodity prices with these sticky, relatively high input costs. It's difficult to operate in a world environment where we have high labor costs. We have really high input costs in the United States relative to some other key players. So I think we want to think smartly about how we can provide value-added products that focus on high value. A reputation of quality and safety, I think, is paramount. I don't know if we've talked enough about that this morning, just the importance of the food safety environment that we have in the United States that is really important to lean on. So those are just a few of my thoughts on how U.S. agriculture can think about how to compete in a really competitive global market.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that, Galia?
Yeah, hey, sure. The other thing is also creating that new demand for new products. Matt talked about that. I think biofuel is important here because we have talked about, how using biofuel, not only it is supporting for the demand for agricultural products, it also is cleaner fuel compared to fossil fuel. And when you think about not every sector in the economy is going to be able to decarbonize and reduce their greenhouse gas emission, but there would still always be room for aviation fuel that is hard to abate, maybe long haul trucking. So the opportunity is really, really wide, really big. And I think it's still, years before we're able to capture all of that. But I think that's something that we can also help thinking about that as well, because that would also create that demand opportunity, especially when you think about farmers in the US, how productive we are, and the seed technology, the farming practices, machineries, all of those have creating this really big yield, potential going forward too. So there got to be an outlet, a sustainable outlet for our products in the future as well. And I think biofuel is very important in that equation.
Before we leave the biofuel side, does anybody else have any comments on the outlook for the bioeconomy? Matt?
Yeah, I would highlight, I think both Amanda and Galia did a great job there. And I want to address the question that the farmer asked there specifically, and he or she made a really good comment about residual. The language used there is very much to what Amanda was mentioning, the difference between a comparative and an absolute advantage. Over time, we get that residual feeling. It means essentially we're falling behind on the comparative advantage portion of it. Just a way to think about that is if your cost of production is in dollars, it's very, very hard to sell into a currency market that's illiquid or has challenges, financial stability challenges. You're losing that advantage. And so to Amanda and Galia's really, really solid points there, that means that value added portion and the increased domestic consumption is a huge portion of that. Biofuels being a huge one, specifically for our corn and our soy products. On the soy side, that's going to mean some very, very hard and challenging policy side to get through some of the 45Z credits, some of the kind of long-term outlook pieces that we need to make official to get that growth and get the crush capacity here, similar to an Argentinian model, which crushes most of their beans in Argentina, exports oil and meal. That would be the same model that we would follow, crushing the value here and then producing a higher percentage of it here, exporting off the pieces. That comes with challenges. It will. Same way that ethanol came with some really, really long-term challenges. But if you go back to 2007, we're still talking about gasoline and not ethanol. Huge difference between the value of corn then and the value of corn now. Could be the same for soybeans. Also, of course, I think Galia made a great point on SAF, sustainable aviation fuel being a huge part of that long-term for that oil demand. But it will be challenging. I'll drop sorry to keep dropping links into there, but I'll drop some of this big shrink thing on this value added piece.
It's a great resource to be able to use that. Jim, I want to bring you in on this value added question. I don't know if you saw there was one question saying, isn't meat a value add for corn and soy producers in our sector? And just how do you think more broadly about the comparative advantage of animal protein for the US in the global market?
Yeah, it's the original converter, right? We called hogs the mortgage lifters for a reason, because we added value to crops, and certainly it paid for college for me. And so as we think about that, right, I mean, where do we really have a competitive advantage, and I think not comparative, but actually raw competitive advantage? These are 40-year investments. And so if I'm going to go build a building, it's a long-term commitment. And so where can we win long-term? I think if you look at coupling, it's got to be a systems-based approach to say, how do we couple further grain processing into those byproducts being then converted into additional high-value material here in the United States, primarily in the form of meat or dairy, right? Dairy is hard to export, and I think if you look at where our competitives are, I think the beef space is in a really, really good place from a value and quality attribute. Right, it's the preferred supplier in the world right now because nobody can match our quality. It's a luxury item, and that's a real win. I like to be in that space. I like to sell Gucci handbags and not something at Walmart. And so I really like that space. I think the chicken boys have, because of other long-term trends, they've figured it out. They figured out how do we get to really low cost, and I think they're moving forward ahead there, and I think that future's bright. I think the pig industry is the one that's a bit confused to me. And I think that's a question. We obviously make a lot of meat. We've lived off of bacon. We're not very good at using distillers grains or corn byproducts in the pig business because it really affects bacon quality. So we've got a quality problem there. So we can't use some of those byproducts very efficiently. We've got a quote unquote high value part of the pig, the middle meats on the pig, which are not very desirable today. We've We've gone to try to be the other white meat. And we're not cheaper or better. So we're not as cheap as chicken, not as good as beef. And I think that's a problem. But I think competitively, right, you look at how do we convert and how do we use that in a way. Livestock has to be part of that picture. And I think livestock has to be part of the picture on the input cost piece as well. So we got to figure out how do we distribute the critters near the corn so we can recycle those nutrients back into the crop space. And we spent some time thinking about that. But we're at a spot in the pig business that we're going to have to turn over that industry from an asset standpoint. Those buildings were all built in 2000. They're starting to get worn out. And so what do we do? So I think there's some opportunity. I think the challenge for the beef guys is how do they align supply chains to get quality metrics at the plant aligned with cow-calf productivity so that the profitability there. The cattle business, by and large, is still a trading business, at least on the feeding end. And so it's a trading business, not an operating business. And how do we think about that? And how do we continue to make sure we're producing that quality product? Because it's a spot for us to win and convert grain into the first value add product.
Thank you, Jim.
Hey,
Any other?
Jim?
Yeah, go ahead.
Jim, would you mind commenting on the rise of Mexico as it relates with exports of pork and cheese and some of those products too?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So if everybody's not aware, we export a huge amount of pork. I'm less familiar on the cheese, but a huge amount of pork into Mexico, primarily the back leg. So the ham what we call a ham in the US, but it all goes green. So uncured ham. So it's used in Mexican cooking, and they just don't make enough pigs in Mexico. Pig's only got 2 legs, and so it's like he's only got 2 ribs, right? I mean, so on a steer, and so that's a limited quantity, and so sending those, and that's really added support. So 10 years ago, to show you how trade influences things, 10 to 12 years ago, the value is in the loin and exporting that to Japan, and that's where all the value is created. And we couldn't give bellies away, and the hams are almost free. And today, as we've thought about that carcass value, now the ham and the belly are the really valuable parts, and we're not sure what to do with the loin because we're not exporting that much to Japan. I mean, you've highlighted that population decline in Japan, and so that market is actually shrinking for us. And so it's really interesting to think about the meat business. Unlike the car business, where it's an aggregate business, we take parts and put them together and sell one product. We take one thing and we bust it into a million pieces and sell it. There's 300 or 400 SKUs out of a pig carcass, and I think there's about that many out of a beef carcass. And so figuring out that mix and how we do that, and Mexico has become a huge trade partner. I mean, this trade conversation we're having, or whatever we want to call it, with our friends in Mexico right now. I think if you look at the pig business and the corn business, we send a lot of corn down there, right? That's really going to be an interesting bit, because if we lose that ham business to Brazil, what does that do to the long-term structure of the pork industry? Because that's actually where we're creating a lot of carcass value today.
Great, thank you, Jim. While we have you on the mic, Jim, there's a question that just came in that I'd like to go ahead and have you take and maybe unpack a little bit of the alphabet soup that's in there for us all for the rest of the items. So it's in addition to lower costs of production for crops, South America also enjoys very high health and low cost of production in animal agriculture. Can Jim comment on some of the reasons Brazil and Argentina have been able to remain free of the alphabet soup diseases and many of the broader challenges facing the US, China, and the EU? Does the industry need to change its approach to production, its tools to manage disease, or is it just a matter of time before South America faces the same issues?
So the alphabet soup, so HPAI is highly pathogenic avian influenza, and that's what we were talking about there with bird flu. Coming in as bird flu, and PRRS is PRRSV, is a viral disease of pigs, which causes both reproductive and respiratory disease. And so most economically important disease in China, the US, and probably Europe. No, Europe would argue ASF right now. I think they have been protected because those are highly aligned, particularly South America is a highly aligned industry. Very few players, very, very concentrated. And so they've been able to put up fences. They also brought an industry in that was new. So they built new. They didn't have an existing industry that we built like we did in the US, right? We had a lot of pigs and chickens in the US, and then we decided to build commercial farms. And so we kind of got all of our diseases with us. Should we have a new approach in the US? Yes, I think that's a discussion that has to be had about what do we do there? And I think the industry is trying to have those conversations, and it's really hard. We are not the low-cost producer of pork today. We were for a long, long time, and we are not today. And so that's, I think, will get everybody's attention, and we'll think about that. I also think that if you look at Brazil, one disease introduction there is a disaster in terms of their ability to keep up because the system's so tightly woven together. So I think you don't wish ill on anybody, but if that is set up, that's a real mess for them. I think we also have to remember that those countries are still FMD positive, foot and mouth disease positive in certain regions. It's not all roses and sunshine down there. And so there are some challenges that they've got. And then there's a political overtone to that, right? I mean, who is Brazil going to get along with this BRICS conversation versus who are we going to get along with? And they're certainly not incented today to have trade wars with some of their key trading partners. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's not a policy comment. That's just their approach is to pure exporting countries. So they kind of take a different approach. And so they are a real player. We're going to have to compete. I think we have a space in terms of quality, efficiency, et cetera, that we should be able to win in, but we're going to have to commit to do that and do that in a way that lives with probably in a higher disease environment than what they're going to see in Brazil. That's just a fact.
Thanks, Jim. Before we move on with some of the other questions in the section, I want to bring Joanie and Galia in with a couple of questions that came from the farmers I reached out to in advance. So maybe, Joanie, if I start with you, first, just to piggyback on some of the conversations, I'm curious at the farm level in your network that you're speaking with, if you can comment on any value-added strategies that you're seeing in your farmer network and how they think about risk management as they're switching, either from a value-added standpoint or if you're seeing farmers making different choices on the crops that they're going to plant either this season or the next.
I've not seen a big switch in crop rotation. We will have some swings from time to time, but even in those years where one crop is more enticing than the other, I think for the most part, we have a good bit of discipline in trying to keep that steady. Because if you look at the longevity of the markets and that type of thing, that in the long run, they come out more equal than some seem to think at first. The biggest change that I have seen is that the producer is actively engaging together at the same time, the risk management people with their marketing people. And I've probably seen more producers use more outside marketing consultants than I ever have before. I think they've all kind of maybe subscribed to different people that they listen to or different advisors. But this year we did several joint meetings of taking their marketing programs with our risk management and putting a plan together specific for those growers. And I think we will continue to see more and more of that. And as the producers incorporate all the pieces into one, I think that they're being able to utilize the specialties of everyone's area and allowing them to shore up their business and not leave as much to chance.
Great. Thank you, Joanie. And we at Farm Foundation are a big tent in terms of all types of production, and some of the larger family farms in our network reached out and talked about the need or the desire for changes in the caps and limits for some of the insurance products to enable some of the larger production systems and operations to manage their risk. In the associations that you participate, what's the chatter, what's the thinking that you see in terms of changing some of those caps and limits?
Well, in regards to the livestock, especially with the beef and pork, they have raised limits, and I think they'll continue to address those and raise those as we go. I think there will, as they become more comfortable, as the AIPs become and the reinsurers become more comfortable in how to protect their risk, that will be much like crop insurance, and those caps will be taken off. Don't know that for sure, but I mean, just for the conversations and stuff, like I said, they've already addressed a lot of the beef and pork limitations, and I would expect that will end up and go in again. And increase again, as well as incorporating other portions of the industry, really being able to focus on like the cow-calf producers, and being able to ensure or protect those unborn calves, and come up with programs that will be able to help them diversify their risk.
Thank you, Joanie. Kanlaya, I was going to pivot next to you and actually talk about any shifts you're seeing in the innovation in equipment in patterns, and it may be too early to tell, but then a question came in just as I was going to ask that. So I'll start with you, Kanlaya, and then pivot to the rest of the panel on innovation. But first, Kanlaya, with you, for example, would you anticipate seeing an increase in precision ag adoption as a measure for being able to manage the input costs and so forth?
Absolutely. And when you look at the machinery market, we always evolve. You know, in the past, maybe we focus on the bigger machine, the faster machine, the more power, horsepower, and things like that. And now we continue to evolve into looking at the data. How can we use it to leverage that data into making farmers' decision easier, managing the cost? Maybe I'll highlight a few things that these technology and data can help farmers in many different ways. Maybe the first one is, you know, when you look at the trend now, is there are just a lot of decisions farmers have to make on the farm. And then you throw in these economics uncertainties, the trade uncertainties. So those are a lot of things. So this is where, when you talk about the adoption of technology, I think that's going to continue to increase, because that's where automation allows you to address those, right? Those are, you don't have to be control of every options on the machine. Let the machine do that for you. Let our auto track, the true set or the setting on combine automation, let that do that decision for you. Then farmers can spend time on things that's a high value added, looking at risk management, looking into the insurance or marketing your crops. So those are the things that allow machine and technology to do. The other part, Sherry, you talk about input cost. Yes, things that exact shot, the see and spray allow farmers to reduce the input, be more precise what they're doing. And as we'll see how the 45Z and Smart Ag practices, how that's going to turn out. But by doing those, managing the input cost or managing the input applied to their crops, that's also could allow them to be able to earn the revenue stream from those sustainable practices. That's another revenue for farmers. And then, you know, also technology allow farmers to improve their yield. Every time you go into this planting season, this growing season, that's the one shot that farmers has. How can you get the best yield out of your crops, out of your field? Those technology that we have allow farmers to do that with the exact emerge, allow little seeds to grow into uniform emergence. So all of those are just technology that we continue to evolve. And I think as farmers seeing the uncertainties or the high cost environments, that's just going to lend itself into be able to use this technology. And on top of that, let me ask one last thing is to address the labor scarcities as well, because those are not going to go away. I think we always have this problem in the past. And if you look at going forward, I think this problem of labor and time is going to continue to be with us. So I think those are where technologies on the equipment and precision agriculture are going to continue to play a bigger role for us as well.
Great, thank you, Gali. Yes, as I heard from the farmers in our network, I think the three top cost concerns were input costs being too sticky, equipment costs overall, including repairs, and this is agnostic of color, so we can just talk about it, not for any particular company, but equipment costs, repair costs being so high. And then the third one on labor, and actually there was a clear shout out on animal ag and the needs for labor being all year round, not the seasonal labor that is often more in the headlines. So some real concerns there across the producers. So I did want to open the innovation question that came in to the rest of the panel as well. So the question is, innovation is important to every industry, including ag, with the challenging current ag environment, general uncertainty on policy, and likely budget cuts on some programs that may have historically helped pay for experimentation. What is your point of view on adoption of new products and services over the next couple of years? Anybody want to dive into that one? Nobody wants to dive into that one.
We all start with that. I think just like our products continue to address farmer challenges. When you talk about challenges over the next few years, you talked about cost, and we have technology to address that. And also, I think we brought back a lot about how farmers can remain competitive, and I think those are the ways that allow farmers to reduce cost. And in addition to that, Jerry, you talked about higher cost of operation, right? Everything is just cost more. I think in the machinery side, that's why we also have options of not only you buy the new equipment, but we have these retrofit, the ability to get to use technology, but at a much lower cost, be able to upgrade your machines to use this technology. And also we have a way of you only pay for the model that you only pay for what you use, and you don't have to pay for what you don't use. So that solution as a service business model is also help addressing some of these higher cost environments as well.
Thank you, Matt, and then to Jim. Matt first.
Yeah, I'll be super quick because I know there's a lot of comments here, and I realize right now there's concerns over funding, which I think we all have, and that is an issue. In terms, though, of thinking about the decline in farm income, I think we're very similar to that 2014 through 17-ish period. And you think about that period where farm income was declining, particularly in the grain sector. That was one of our better periods of innovation in terms of technology on the farm. I mean, Golly, you can go through and talk about some of the things that Deere came out, 94, 9200 series tractors. I mean, they were game changers. So I understand where I'm going with this. I understand the immediate reaction, but I do think periods of decline also can really bring about innovation, which we saw during that period, and it paid dividends in the future. I'll stop there and let the others talk.
Thanks, Matt. Jim.
Yeah, I think in the livestock space, it's really interesting but challenging. We haven't seen a lot of solutions that come forward that create material changes in value, really cost efficiency. So we tend to be working on very small problems that are not very integrated. And so we have a measurement problem in the livestock industry. We don't know much about what's going on in the process. So we kind of breed them and then we kill them. And somewhere in the middle, we don't know what's happening. We'd like to tell you we do, but we probably don't know as much as we need. And so I think it'll be interesting. There's a lot of activity in that space, but it's a small market. Funding's tough. Not nearly the same space as crop. And so the thing that's interesting and maybe not happening is this gene editing thing. And so if we can get disease resistant critters through gene editing, which we know we can do for a couple of diseases, that's a really promising efficiency tool and a welfare tool, but I'm not sure where we're going to be on the consumer acceptance tool. And so much to be learned and had there as we plot down that path over the next few years.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Did you have another comment, Matt, or is the hand lingering from before?
I'm good. Just lingering.
Okay, great. I want to just make sure there was a couple more questions on the bioeconomy and renewable energy. So I'm just going to read them both out just to make sure we didn't have any gaps there before we close out. So the two questions in there were, what policies and investments are needed to accelerate the growth of the bioeconomy, ensuring that sustainable agricultural innovations translate into viable market opportunities for farmers and agribusinesses? So that's the first one. And then the second one was, how does the adoption of renewable energy in the ag sector impact the ag value chain in this discussion? So anybody want to wade in those waters? Amanda?
Hi, Sherry. Actually, what I did want to bring a little bit more or additional to our discussion, just in thinking about innovation, which relates to the question about the bioeconomy. As an educator, as someone who works at Colorado State University, I just really want to highlight the importance of continual investment in both research and education. We also had a question about, training the next generation of agricultural producers and consumers. And what's been really heavy on my mind, heavy is the wrong word, but really prominent in my mind is just really the importance of highlighting education and the importance of all sorts of different types of education. So not just the four-year institutions where I work, but for sure the four-year institutions where I work, trade school, our junior college systems. And when I think about the tremendous efforts that we're putting in at the university level, specifically to really react to the changing landscapes of agriculture and all of this innovation, when I think about our agribusiness program, we just have increasing exponential access to information. And so I think it's just really important that we recognize and acknowledge the importance in investing in training our next generation of agricultural producers. And another example of thinking about innovation in that space is we have a new program at Colorado State University that's focused on livestock business management, which combines agribusiness and animal sciences. And so I think at the university level, we're really thinking about how we have this changing landscape of agricultural production, a different changing landscape in how we produce things and the markets that we're participating in. So when it comes to both innovation and technology, the bioeconomy, so these additional questions that you were bringing in, I think having really nimble and problem-solving young people is really important to help us tackle these challenges. And so I just want to highlight that just an importance to recognize the importance that the important role that education can play in training our next generation of the agricultural workforce.
Great. That's a great tone as we're reaching the end here soon. And as you know, Farm Foundation is all in helping support and encourage the next generation and equip the next generation too. Matt, I'll give you the final word on this topic before we hand it back to Tim.
Thank you, Sherry. In my view, most of the discussion around the regenerative and around some of the bio has mostly been on practices, like farming practices. How do we grow it this way? How do we make the crop do what we want it to do? Whether that's a new crop, whether it's different seeds, whether it's different technology that Kanlaya has pointed out. What needs to change, in my view, is to go from conversation around practices to product. We know how to do it now. We have to get a product for that to the marketplace that the marketplace wants. Probably the best example of this is, I think, hidden in agriculture, and that's wine. You can go and you can buy boxed wine, or you can go to the Napa and the Sonomas of the world, and you can buy wine that has very specific products that match what their consumers want. And on that bottle, it will tell you all of their ag all of their ag practices, their products, and exactly how they made that wine. And it's a market that is segmented in that way. We've got to get there too, with corn, with wheat, with whatever other products that we are from this renewable standpoint. That's the biggest switch that needs to happen in my mind.
If I can have one last word. You asked me what policy should we have. I think we need a policy, just not just being in the limbo like what we have been with 45Z, just very difficult for everybody to plan, especially all those big investments. So I think we need the certainties there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to, you were smiling earlier and I was guessing you had a thought bubble there. So I appreciate you sharing that before we close out. So before I pass it over to Tim, I just want to make sure that you each as panelists know our deep gratitude for being with us today. I know our audience would agree. At a time of high change, it's important to gather and get the insights and expertise from all of you. And we know this is just the beginning of the year, so there's more to come. So really appreciate your time and insights today. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Tim.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I will echo your thanks. I think it's remarkable to hear so many of these different points of view from the sector all in one place, and we're really grateful to that. Thanks everyone too in the audience for joining us and submitting your really great questions. We appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey that you'll see at the conclusion of the forum. If you'd like to help us continue providing valuable programming such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. And I've seen some of those come in already, so thank you for those of you that have joined. But just check the link provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities. And we're very grateful for your support. Thank you once again for joining us today, and this will conclude our forum.